What's up, guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I have a returning guest. You guys absolutely devoured the interview that I did with this guest last year, and since that dropped, you have been requesting his return. And today I am thrilled to say that I am joined by Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones to discuss his new book titled The Cleopatras, The Forgotten Queens of Egypt. Now, normally I would start these interviews by going into some context about Dr. Llewellyn-Jones, tell you guys a little bit about him, as well as let him introduce himself and his love of the subject, where his ambition came from in order to become a professor and a public-facing historian. However, we did that all in our other episodes for his previous book, which was titled Persians, the Age of Great Kings. So if you want to learn more about all of that, you can go and check out that interview, because today we are going to be focusing on ancient Egypt and the powerful women within it. Now, I do just want to let you guys know we will not be able to get into all of the Cleopatras in depth, because yes, there are more than one, if you can't guess by the title of the book. And because we are crunched for time, we're just going to have to do a very general overview, which means I will be linking as much as I possibly can in the description below about the other Cleopatras, as well as Cleopatra VII, who is the famous Cleopatra. So with all that being said, Dr. Llewellyn-Jones, it is about time that we turn to you again. So before we can dive into all of these incredibly powerful women, do you mind starting us off by orienting us? Can you give us an image of what ancient Egypt looks like, what period we are starting with, so that way we can kind of springboard into talking about the players of this time?
So the book picks up really in the middle of the Hellenistic period. So the Hellenistic period is the name we've traditionally given in scholarship for the years between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE. But the Cleopatras picks up in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, so around about 180 BCE, and goes to 30 BCE. So it's in what we call the late Hellenistic period, or what I've called, alongside my colleague Alex Macaulay, we've titled it the High Hellenistic period, because the Hellenistic period has very often been sort of like shunted to the side by ancient historians who want to deal with, the glories of classical Athens or this kind of thing. And the Hellenistic period has often been seen as a kind of slide into depravity. And if that's happening, then the late Hellenistic period is the slide to the slide of depravity. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think what's happening in the 2nd and 1st centuries is actually a kind of culmination of all the arts and literature, poetry of the Hellenistic period. And we should see it actually as a high point of Hellenistic civilization. So that's the background to the book, where we also have in this period, of course, the Greek world meeting with the indigenous cultures of the ancient Near East as well. So Greeks in Asia Minor, Greeks in the Levant, and of course, in the case of my book, the Greeks in Egypt as well. And that's one of the really interesting things, of course, the features about the Hellenistic world is this kind of mashup of Greekness and indigenous cultures too.
Actually, let's talk about that, because you highlight that in the introduction of the book as well, is the influence of Greek culture in Egypt at this time as well. And I think that tends to be something that people are quite surprised by when coming from the outside in. So if you could talk a little bit more about that specifically to Egypt, which obviously ends up then influencing this family and this history.
Yeah, exactly. So to appreciate what's going on here, we have to remember that Egypt was part of the Persian Empire for 200 years. It had broken away, it had been reconquered by Persia. And then when Alexander the Great comes along and liberates Egypt from the Persian rule, he's kind of accepted, therefore, as a kind of legitimate pharaoh who comes in as a sort of savior figure for the Egyptians. And he establishes, therefore, a Macedonian dynasty in Egypt. And upon his death, eventually, not immediately, but eventually, Egypt becomes ruled by one of his Macedonian generals, a man called Ptolemy. And what Ptolemy does essentially is to give sort of tax rebates and land privileges to Greeks who want to come and settle into Egypt. Now, Egypt had been very well known to the Greek world for centuries and centuries. Homer talks about Egypt. The tragedians of Athens talk about it. Of course, Herodotus devotes a lot of book 2 of his histories to Egypt, and I've no doubt that he actually visited this place. And I think for many people, Greek speakers who knew these kind of works, Egypt was a sort of a place of fabulousness, a sort of oriental mystery and magic, and also it was famous for its wealth as well. So I think Ptolemy, when he established this kind of setup whereby he was inviting settlers, colonizers, to come into Egypt, I think you get this kind of sense that you had in the American Midwest in the 1850s and 1860s. There's gold in their hills. So I think that Greek speakers flocked to Egypt from all over the Greek-speaking world. And so they were given these kind of tax rebates. They were given plots of land to settle on. So what we see is a slow process of colonization, Hellenization, going on in Egypt at this time. And that's made very evident by the place in which these settlers were creating their homes. Most of them settled in the Nile Delta. So that's at the very north of Egypt, looking out towards the Mediterranean Sea, looking out, of course, towards the Greek-speaking world. And the great cultic center of all of that, of course, was the great city of Alexandria, established by Alexander the Great, but made beautiful and glorious by Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, and Ptolemy III in particular, who built their, palaces, the Museum, the great library, wonderful harbor, the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and made Alexandria a sophisticated cultural center for world learning. That attracted even more Greek speakers into the Nile Delta, together also with lots of Jewish settlers as well. So there's a huge Jewish quarter in Alexandria. So the city of Alexandria and the whole of the Nile Delta became a kind of colonial space for these Greeks. Now, of course, way down in the Nile Valley, we have a long, long history there, of course, of Egyptians in places like Abydos, Thebes, Aswan. These ancient cultures are sitting there. Well, the Ptolemies also tried to populate Upper Egypt with Greek colonies, but they weren't so successful there. So they established a city called Ptolemais, not too far from the city of modern-day Luxor, ancient Thebes. But it never had the mass appeal that the Nile Delta had. So I think the Greeks enjoyed living in the Nile Delta, the Fayum, which was really a sort of, a Hellenized center, always looking out to the Mediterranean Sea. When they plummeted or plunged into, Upper Egypt itself, they never really took hold. And that's because there was pretty much a nationalist feeling in Upper Egypt, Egypt for the Egyptians. And I think it's fair to say, and it's something I talk about in the book, as much as the Ptolemies wanted to think that this is a success story of integration, what we are actually dealing with in the Ptolemaic period is a tale of two peoples. The Egyptians come out, sadly, pretty much as maligned second-class citizens. So the Greeks get the tax rebates. Greek becomes the official language of Egypt. If you want to be anyone, you have to be able to speak Greek and to work within the Greek administrative system. And this causes a lot of problems for the Egyptians. So it's not necessarily a comfortable meeting of worlds. And to such an extent, in fact, that under Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I, we have a huge uprising, almost for 10 years, in which the Thebaid really breaks away from Alexandria at all. So we should always think in this period that there are two Egypts sort of kind of mashed together somewhere around the end of the Nile Delta. And I think it's really telling that the way in which the Greeks referred to the city of Alexandria, they always called it Alexandria pros Egyptu, so Alexandria, which is next to Egypt. So not even seeing it as integral to Egypt. And I think that really sets the tone for how the Ptolemies rule this very ancient and venerable land, which they acknowledge, and yet they kind of rule it with a heavy colonialist stamp.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And I think you do such a good job of also highlighting that in the start before we actually meet the key players of this, so
Yeah.
that, you know, you kind of go in with that mindset of going, okay. And then we get introduced to the ladies of this book, who come fast and furious and unbelievably powerful, but wielding power in their own ways. So there's no way we can get into all of them in as much depth as I want to. It is impossible, which is so sad. But we start off, you said Cleopatra the First comes from Syria, if I'm not mistaken. She comes from Syria, and she ends up having Cleopatra the Second, who's her daughter. And what I thought was really interesting about them is that you talk about their power throughout these sections. And I was wondering, you know, for Cleopatra II to wield this manipulative behavior that she ends up doing, you know, you highlight various stories of different historians that mention how incredible she is at negotiations in maybe, you know, not so much the nicest way, in a much darker way. But how do you think these things are being taught between this family? Like, do you think that it's a case of Cleopatra II watching her mother with this kind of power and learning from watching? Do you think that this is being passed down? Because these aren't the only two women who are like this.
No, I mean, every one of the Cleopatras has that ability to govern. I mean, you know, there are several things going on here, I think. I think we are entering a period when the pharaohs, the Ptolemies themselves, by and large tend to be a pretty weak lot of male rulers. But then that might be because they're never really given the opportunity to be strong kings, because these women in their lives step in the place where really we expect men to rule. And I think that's what I find really fascinating about this period, is the topsy-turviness of the whole thing, where the women truly do command the authority of the governance of Egypt itself. But also, they seem to be just naturally much more adept at it than their male counterparts. And I don't think that's a matter of the historiography, you know, creating a fiction about these kind of tigress queens, as it were. I think they just simply were a succession of women who were very able, very willing to step up to the plate as well. I think what I feel, Erica, is when I was working on this, is that observation was the key always. That they very often the younger princesses, before they really come into their maturity, they had the opportunity to sit back and watch their mothers or their aunts or their grandmothers in operation, and they saw the mistakes, but also they saw the potential. And that's what I feel with Cleopatra II. She had watched her mother negotiate a very delicate situation after Cleopatra I's husband, Ptolemy V, had died, and Cleopatra I had to make her way in a foreign court on her own, essentially. So here she is, this Syrian queen, a Seleucid queen, having to create for herself, overcome all the factions at the Ptolemaic court, and create for herself a regency that would last. And that's what Cleopatra does so brilliantly, of course. And I get the feeling that her daughter, who must have been about 12, 13, so, you know, in a state of mind ready to understand these lessons, and knowing full well that her lot in life was to marry her brother and sit on the throne, she must have observed. Whether there were any more sort of, you know, lessons that she actually learned face to face with her mother is difficult to say. And one of the things I try to deal with in the book is, you know, what do we know about relations that went on between parents and children in the Ptolemaic house? And of course, we don't really have much evidence. But if we look at other societies at the same time, say Rome and the Republic, we get the feeling that children were seen and not heard, particularly, you know, they're moved away, brought up by nurses and tutors, and not really with their parents. And I get a feeling there's something like that going on in the royal houses of the Hellenistic world too. So observation, I think, is the key for success.
And you mentioned there how these women, throughout all of them, they're destined to marry their brothers. So we can't really move on from that. We do have to cover that. And you
Yep.
do such a great job in the book of going through this. So I was wondering if you could summarize for us here, because there was, as uncomfortable as this is to say, ancient logic to this for them. Like they
Yeah.
wouldn't have done it if there wasn't anything.
No,
So
no.
do you
So
mind
this is,
explaining that?
yeah, absolutely. So we're dealing here with royal incest, okay? And when I mean incest, I mean physical relationships, physical sexual relationships between brother and sister, sometimes between uncle and niece. No physical relationships between fathers and daughters, but certainly marriages between fathers and daughters. So what's incest all about? Well, we as a human race, so the sociologists tell us, have an inbuilt um, revulsion towards incest. Scholars call it the yuck factor. We just think, oh, we don't just can't envisage that at all. But it's true that throughout history there have been some societies that the elites, in particular, have harnessed the strength and the power that sits behind the image of incest to promote themselves as being on another level of operation, of civilization. And this is what we see under the Ptolemies. Now, the Ptolemies may well have picked up from the priests in Egypt that there had been a tradition in pharaonic Egypt of incest. It's not as big, there's not as much evidence for it as I think the Ptolemies thought there was. But we know that, for instance, Akhenaten certainly had sexual relationship with at least one of his daughters, probably got a daughter on her. Ramesses II married several of his daughters and certainly had a granddaughter by one of his daughters. But really, the evidence for incest in ancient Egypt is pretty much on that level, not much more. But I do get the feeling that the priests or the Ptolemies, were learning about this and they kind of ran with it. And they used this kind of synchronism of these two cultures of Egypt and Greece to give cogency to that whole idea. So when they looked at Egyptian mythology, of course, they found evidence for this kind of incest. They found it very clearly in the story of Isis and her brother husband Osiris, who were the parents of Horus. And Horus, of course, is the god who sits on the Egyptian throne. So every pharaoh, every Ptolemy in Egypt was essentially a reincarnation of Horus. So there's a good precedent, therefore, for these incestuous relationships producing the king. But of course, in the Greek world, we also have incest within mythology. Zeus and Hera are by far the best examples of this as well. And it's something that we tend to forget when we look at Greek mythology. It is there. But also, if we look at the world of Athens, even in the classical period, we can see that a form of incest is there, first cousin marriage and all of this. I mean, very, very close. Not brother and sister, but the next best thing is also going on there too. So it's not something unknown in the Greek world at all. But the Ptolemies pick up on these two mythological traditions, plus the pharaonic tradition, and they run with it. So it becomes the norm from Ptolemy II onwards for every pharaoh, where possible, to marry his sister and to beget children on her. Cleopatra I, incidentally, was brought into Egypt from Syria because Ptolemy V didn't have a sister. And so there was a gap in the market. So they bring in a foreign princess. But as soon as she is regent, she sets up her eldest son and her eldest daughter to marry and reactivate incest again. So because they are kings and queens, and because they are living gods and goddesses, and don't forget, we have to see the Ptolemies in this light, they projected themselves as divine beings on earth, so they can perform in a sexual arena that is more suited to the gods than to humans. Kings and queens can get away with this. And I think that's why, if you look at, the great Sophoclean tragedy, Oedipus the King, he's never called just Oedipus or Oedipus the Incestuous. He is Oedipus, and the incest theme is there because he's king, And what has gone on there essentially is unknown to him, of course, is that he's playing out the royal incest game unbeknownst to him. But Sophocles is almost saying, well, this is natural, isn't it? This is what kings do. They have license to do things we don't. So incest set the Ptolemies apart. What's really interesting is, and I don't get to this in my book, but in the Roman period, after the Romans conquer Egypt, incest is everywhere in ordinary families and everything. It's almost like they take the myth of incest and they spread it out throughout Egyptian society. So it becomes really, really common. It's very, very strange. But in my
That's
period, it's just for
bizarre.
the royal family in my period. Yeah, very strange.
Well, on that strange note, there's another strange note that you mentioned, which we're going to have to work through the family here. So
I'll
we've
do
got
that.
Cleopatra the First, Cleopatra Syra, then we've got Cleopatra the Second. Then we come into contact with Cleopatra Thea. She's the next one. And she finds herself back in Syria.
Yeah.
So how do we get back there when we've sort of, as you've said, mentioned that the original queen comes in from Syria? Why is one then moved back?
So here we're dealing with the old phenomenon of bride exchange, political bride exchange. And this was very common in the Hellenistic houses of antiquity, that to make an alliance with another royal house, you would swap brides. So it was kind of natural in a way, if in one generation a Syrian bride comes into Egypt, later on it's almost inevitable that another Egyptian bride will go back into Syria. And this is Cleopatra the Second's eldest daughter, Cleopatra Thea, who goes in and marries into the Seleucid family. And it's interesting that from that marriage to a series of Seleucid monarchs, actually, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids become completely interbred. So you can't hardly put a pin between them. By the end of the Hellenistic world, these Ptolemies and Seleucids have become one. They were, at loggerheads at the beginning of the Hellenistic period, but by my period in the 2nd century, and then as we go into the 1st century, they're all intermarrying one another constantly. So not only is there incestuous relationships going in Egypt itself, but also there's spin-offs with Egyptian princesses in particular being farmed out to Syrian Seleucid kings. And very often these princesses seem to marry the same brother kings all of the time. So one king, for instance, marries 3 Ptolemaic sisters, one after another. So as one dies, they're replaced.
And in Syria, you write on page 151 that one of the strangest events in Hellenistic history takes place as there is a weird assassination attempt that's going on. I was wondering, with the drama of this, if you could highlight what's going on.
It's really bizarre, So what had happened is that Ptolemy VI, who was a pretty decent ruler, this is the husband of Cleopatra II, he champions a kind of pretender to the Seleucid throne, this guy called Alexander Ballas. And he marries off Cleopatra Thea to this man. And she quickly tires of him. I mean, she is very much like her mother and grandmother. She's a brilliant woman, a natural diplomat, a great governor. And this Ballas is just a nobody, a no-hoper. And as she begins to pull away her support for him, he kind of gets really sort of twitchy, I think. And he makes this bizarre assassination attempt on his ally, Ptolemy VI. And it's never explained in our sources. We don't know why he does it, but he sends out assassins. They fail. And then, of course, Ptolemy VI and the whole Egyptian army turn on him and they oust him from the throne. And Cleopatra Thea is so quick just to divorce him and marry Demetrius II in his stead. It is one of the most bizarre moments in Hellenistic history. And nobody can ever explain what's going on. I just get the feeling that Alexander Ballas just panics and makes these stabs in the dark, quite literally, at Ptolemy VI, and it just doubles back on him. It's crazy, really crazy.
And this is not the only crazy event, you guys. We have so much more to cover, but this was, for me in the book, was like the first one where I went, what is going on? And it doesn't stop there. But
no,
one of the heads of the period that I think is one of the most chaotic and again, this is me from the outside looking in, is this character, he's a real person, but Potbelly comes into the show. So obviously he's there at this time anyways, but really he kind of starts to make himself known. So first and foremost, I thought it was really interesting that, again, I think from the outside looking in, people look at the ancient world, they're like, people are super chiseled and they look like Greek statues and this amazing, you know, they're all beautiful and athletic, and Potbelly is not. Can you give us a bit of a character profile for this man before we dive in?
Just to give a little prologue, none of this is made up. You know, it's all there in the sources. I just had to pull it all together. So sometimes, you know, truth is more fantastical than fiction sometimes, you know. So Potbelly was the younger brother of Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI, a very ambitious young man, was determined to hold power in some way, shape, or form. He was from birth already kind of aberration against nature. People wrote of him, for instance, that he must have been suckled by a wild goat rather than a nursemaid, because he was always lustful. He was also destructive. The Greeks believed, you know, that what you ingest, you know, as a child, you kind of developed into. So with all these stories about him being sort of half goat, he developed into a young man, an adolescent of hideous cruelties. I mean, he's the kind that would have, you know, tortured puppies and kittens. He's that kind. And he became grotesquely fat. He was very, very short, stumpy legs, huge belly, enormous appetite for food. He was a great connoisseur and a gastronome, but you also get the feeling that he just would have wolfed down anything available to him. He was very well educated. He wrote several books. He wrote books of poetry. He was obsessed about Homer, but also he had this vindictive, cruel side to him and delighted in the cruelty as well, and really was power mad. And he, at one point, manages to wrangle himself onto the throne alongside his brother and sister, Cleopatra II, Ptolemy VI, and Ptolemy VIII, Potbelly, all three of them sitting very uncomfortably on one throne together at one point. Cleopatra II clearly loathed him. I mean, a deep, deep loathing was in her heart for her brother, and he had no love for her whatsoever. So it's ironic, really, that after the death of Cleopatra II's eldest brother, husband, Ptolemy VI, fate almost inevitably threw her into the path of her younger brother, Ptolemy VIII, Potbelly, whom she had to marry, of course, because there was no real choice for her. If she wanted to maintain her position as a very able queen of Egypt, then she needed a pharaoh on her throne. And of course, her only choice was to go to her brother, and their relationship was strained, to say the least. Now, he wasn't an unable pharaoh. He was actually a very good pharaoh. But because of this relationship with his sister was so chaotic, it simply brought disaster after disaster onto the governance of Egypt itself. They simply could not function as a working government. Where have we heard that before? You know, I mean, it's all, you know, it's not so disfamiliar to us, is it? And it got even worse because Cleopatra the Second had given birth to two daughters and at least two sons. The one daughter then is Cleopatra Thea that we talked about, but there's a younger daughter, and this is Cleopatra the Third, and she was just like her mother and grandmother, a mover and a shaker. And when Cleopatra III became about 16, it was quite clear to her that there was nowhere for her to go. You know, what was she going to be? What would she become? Would she ever have a chance of being a queen of Egypt herself? And it didn't look like she had many options. So what does she do? Well, she marries her stepfather uncle. She marries Potbelly too. So at the same time, Potbelly has sitting on the throne one wife, Cleopatra II, and on the other side of the throne, her daughter, Cleopatra III. Now, that does not make for a happy family unit at all, because inevitably there are jealousies, there are power plays going on. And what Cleopatra III, the younger wife, has in her favor is that she is fertile, she's young. She can give Ptolemy as many children as she possibly can. Whereas by this point, Cleopatra III is about 45, 50, which in antiquity was pushing it, of course, you know, and her days of reproduction were strictly limited. She'd given birth to a son to Potbelly, whom they called Memphites. And it was quite clear that she was placing all of her hope and ambitions on her son. Cleopatra III, meanwhile, gave birth to 2 sons and 3 daughters. And she was placing all of her future ambitions on her litter of children as well. So we've got what's going on here is what we call a classic amphimetric dispute between 2 mothers, not necessarily for their own power, but for the longevity of their families. And Ptolemy the Eighth, Potbelly in the middle of this, relishing it, absolutely loving what's going on, you know, and this complete breakdown of family unit, and because of that, a breakdown of the governance of Egypt itself, to a point, of course, where something has to snap, and it does snap, and Cleopatra II emerges as the victor. She manages to take power in Alexandria, thanks mainly to the patronage that she gave to the Jews of Alexandria, who really championed her, including army officers. And she managed to push Potbelly, Cleopatra III, and their brood of children off to Cyprus in exile. But what happens there is quite interesting. As they flee Alexandria, you know, the nursery is packed up and all the babies are shipped off. But with them also goes Memphites, the son of Cleopatra II. Now, why he's gone with them, we don't know. But certainly when they're in Cyprus, Potbelly uses the figure of Memphites to really goad his sister wife. So he erects monuments, for instance, in which written on them is, you know, dedicated by Memphites, the son of Potbelly and the beloved stepson of Cleopatra III, not mentioning his mother. Now, I doubt very much that Memphites had anything to do with the establishment of these monuments. This is a way that Potbelly could goad his sister back in Alexandria. But things come to an even worse head with the most grand guignol of all these spectacles. So Cleopatra's 50th birthday arrives, and as she's receiving gifts from dignitaries all over the Hellenistic world, a large chest, beautifully worked, arrives, and it kind of has a, you know, birthday card attached to it. Lots of love from Potbelly and Cleopatra the daughter. And Cleopatra II thinks, well, what on earth is in here? And she opens the box, and what she finds there is the dismembered body of Memphites, with his head placed on his dismembered arms and legs and torso. And of course, it's horrific. But that's the kind of man that Potbelly was. He would go to that kind of extreme to hurt people. There's a kind of Trumpian thing going on, I think, with Potbelly. Revenge, retribution is something that means a lot to him.
It's crazy when I was reading this period that, like, there's so much, oh, this is going to sound really bad, so much juicy history in here that you're like, oh my God, why didn't anybody write like a stellar play about this? Because it's just, from this point, it just gets mad and like just worse and worse and worse. And we have the introduction, as you've mentioned, of, as I said, off camera to you, my new favorite woman, who's Cleopatra III. She is, you guys, I will try and link as much as I can in the description below. She is terrifying to a different degree, but she ends up having children with Potbelly. And what I would love to sort of start with is she's got very different reactions to both of her sons. She seems to like one of them and absolutely loathe the other. So can you kind of tell us about this?
You know, this isn't unique in history. There are often times when you find that one parent loves one more child more than the other. Very famously, Xenophon opens his Anabasis by saying, you know, Parasatis, the queen of Persia, had 2 sons. She loved Cyrus more than she did Artaxerxes. So it's, you know, it's not uncommon. But among the Ptolemies, yes, Ptolemy the Ninth, whom everybody called Chickpea. That was his nickname. And then Ptolemy X, she adored her younger son, Ptolemy X. Just he couldn't do any wrong. Whereas poor Chickpea could do nothing right at all. And when Potbelly died, his will stipulated that Cleopatra III could appoint on the throne whichever one of her two sons she wished. And this is a really lovely, dark, black comedy moment, really, because of course Potbelly knew that Cleopatra couldn't resist putting her favorite younger son on the throne. So when she tries that, the Alexandrian mob just raise up in revolt, throw him, Ptolemy X, off out of Egypt and off onto Cyprus, and establishes Chickpea on the throne. And from that moment on, Cleopatra has to sit on the throne with her much-hated eldest son, seething at everything he did and completely stealing the limelight whenever she could. And she niggles him and she's cruel to him on every level. And in fact, Chickpea, the nickname Chickpea, may well have been a nickname that she gave the boy himself, because it's kind of dismissive, isn't it? Chickpea, you're nothing, We know that he, in preparation for his role as pharaoh, had married his eldest daughter, his eldest sister, Cleopatra IV. This woman was clearly a threat to her mother, Cleopatra III, because she forced this couple, who were very much in love, I know it's bizarre, incestuous love, but they were in love, to divorce. She'd given Chickpea 3 children by that time, but Cleopatra III insisted that she divorce. And that's because I think she saw Cleopatra IV as too powerful, too able, too much like herself, I think, to be in that position. And she married Chickpea to his youngest sister, Cleopatra Selene, who was only 11 or 12 and therefore a complete ingenue, knew nothing at all. And then throughout the reign, Cleopatra III promotes herself over her son on every possible thing she can do. So in all of the titles, it's always her name is first. On coinage, it's her portrait rather than Ptolemy the Ninth. And even there's a magnificent wall relief on the Temple of Hathor in Dir el-Medina in Thebes, where the 3 great titular deities of Thebes, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, are being placated by the monarchs. Cleopatra stands in front of Chickpea, which is something that Egyptian art never shows. It's always the pharaoh and then the queen. But here she completely reverses everything. So poor Chickpea has no power whatsoever for 18 years of his reign, until it comes to the moment where Cleopatra can stand him no longer, and she calls Ptolemy X, her favorite son, back to Alexandria, and Chickpea is driven over to Cyprus instead. And then she makes war on him. She leads a naval expedition against him, and she loathes the poor boy so much. But what's incredible is that Ptolemy X is just completely incapable of ruling. He's a mummy's boy. He is in her shadow completely, and that's what she likes, of course. But I mean, he is so stupid. I mean, he's just not a ruler. And again, as soon as he comes into Egypt, she lords it over him. She forces him to marry Cleopatra Selene, whom, of course, she had divorced from Ptolemy the Ninth, Chickpea. And then after her death, she forces him to marry his niece. So for 2 reigns, we have these puppet kings in the hands of their mother. And I think what I love most about her, because I'm like you, I'm a huge fan of this dark character. She creates for herself more royal and religious titles than any pharaoh or royal woman in Egypt's history ever, including she becomes the chief priestess in the cult of Alexander the Great. No woman had ever done that before. And she declares herself to be the new living Isis. So she is the goddess incarnate on earth. And in the great festivals of Alexandria that she held in Alexandria, this is how she would promote herself, in the full sort of fancy dress costume as the goddess Isis. She controlled everything. She sent out expeditions, military expeditions, but also expeditions into Africa for trade. I mean, she was a real mover and shaker, terrified of nobody. And I think one of the things that, and clearly just a brilliant diplomat, and one of the things she was exceptionally good at was weighing up the power struggles that were going on in the wider Mediterranean world. And she saw that Rome could easily be a threat to Egypt. And what she did was she implemented what we would now call soft power, soft diplomacy, to keep the Romans sweet. So she would do things like invite senators to Egypt and give them lavish holidays, Nile cruises, in which they would see the wonders of Egypt and the richness of it, but keeping them sweet all the time. And I think sometimes without Cleopatra III having done that, Egypt probably would have fallen to the Romans a lot earlier than it eventually did. So she knew how to work politics to her own good. She dies at about the age of 70, 77, something like this. And how does she die? She dies at the hands of her most beloved son, Ptolemy X, who probably strangles her. He's had enough, and he gets rid of his mother that way.
What an amazing story. Like,
I know,
honestly,
she is incredible.
She's just an icon. Like, since I read that, I was like, I am obsessed.
Yeah.
I want all of the retellings. I want all the more books. Like, if you guys read this and you're like, wow, this is so interesting, please write a book. Send it to me.
Somebody should write a book on Cleopatra.
I would love that. She's just amazing.
She's a Joan Collins. That's when I see her, I see Joan Collins in my head. That's how I see the dynasty actress, in the 1980s, power shoulders. It's all that kind of. That's what I see with Cleopatra. Yeah.
But you mentioned the Romans, so I'm also aware of the time, so we should bring it to the most famous Cleopatra that I know everybody's clicked on this video to hear about. But I would love to highlight when it comes to Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra, guys. She is just as brutal as everybody that we have discussed. And in particular, I think something that is often glossed over. Long story short, guys, obviously Cleopatra VII, she ends up meeting Caesar. They have a kid together. She then goes to Rome when he's assassinated. She then realizes, oh no, there's nothing in the will for us. She goes back to Egypt, right? That was a very long and short of it. The fascinating thing about this is that she goes to Egypt, and the first thing that she does when she gets there is she kills her brother immediately. And no one ever talks about that. So why does Cleopatra VII do this? Like, why does she decide this has to get done? He's got to go.
That's a really good question. In fact, she kills two brothers in a way. She has two, at the time of her accession to the throne, she has two brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. And her father's will stipulates that she has to marry one of the brothers. Now, at the time that she meets Julius Caesar, she's already married to Ptolemy XIII. She has no love for him. She doesn't want to rule with him. She breaks with him. And this is why the Alexandrian War breaks out. This is when the great library of Alexandria is burned. But Julius Caesar insists that she marries her brother according to the will. Eventually, in the Alexandrian War, this Ptolemy is killed in battle. And so she's free. But straight away, Caesar forces her to marry her younger brother according to her father's will. So while she gives birth to Caesarion, their child, Julius Caesar's child, at the same time she is married Egyptian style to her brother, just as every other Ptolemaic queen, every other Cleopatra has been. But she rejects that. So after Caesar's death, as you say, when she comes back to Egypt, in fact, poor Ptolemy XIV doesn't even get back to Egypt. She probably drowned him. She threw him off the ship and drowned him on the way back to Egypt. So she arrives in Egypt as a single woman, a widow, in fact, really, twice widowed, both of her Egyptian husband, brother, but also of Julius Caesar. And here again, she uses all of that mythology to stress who she is. So she is Isis. Her murdered husband was Osiris, just as he was murdered in the mythology. That's Julius Caesar. So who is Caesarion? Well, he is Horus, of course. divorce. So she uses all that again. Now, what's really fascinating about Cleopatra VII is that she too, like the other Cleopatras, works assiduously for the succession, and all of her ambition, her power, her energy goes to securing the throne for Caesarion, for the son of Julius Caesar. That's all she lives for. And I think this is often overlooked in the work that's done on Cleopatra. She is not concerned with Egypt for herself. Everything is for Caesarion. And we see that almost straight away. So in that reverse of what I told you about Cleopatra III and Chickpea, at Dendera Temple in Middle Egypt, we have a huge 30-foot high image of Cleopatra and Caesarion. Caesarion, who was only a little boy at this time, is depicted as a man, and he stands in front of Cleopatra VII, who stands in his rear. So again, the world has come back to order. Everything she does is for him, including the relationship with Mark Antony. Now, it's quite clear that when she looked at Roman politics, that the up-and-coming man in Rome, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son and nephew, would obviously not permit Caesarion to occupy any form of status in the Roman world. So she throws a lot in with Mark Antony, who, of course, is Octavian's, more or less, his opponent. I don't think at all that this was ever a love match, despite what Plutarch sort of suggests, and certainly what Shakespeare made of it. I think Cleopatra was far too intelligent to fall for Mark Antony. What she does, she creates herself as a kind of showgirl for him. Mark Antony was a blunt soldier with a soldier's tastes in things. He liked cheap booze, he liked cavorting around, and what she does, she puts on a cheap trick to capture a cheap man, essentially. So she sails up the river Kidnus, in her love boat. She dresses as the goddess Aphrodite. She brings him back to Alexandria. She woos him. She seduces him. They dress up together. They get drunk together. I mean, it's the Liz Taylor Burton thing, really being played out in reality here. And I think that's the way that she saw him. Of course, he does give her 3 children. But in the very famous Donations of Alexandria, where Mark Antony doles out the Roman Empire to Cleopatra and her children, the one who comes out of it the most, of course, best, is Caesarion, where he gets called King of Kings and so forth. And it's very clear that Cleopatra's influence over Mark Antony is of such an extent that he is willing to overlook his own 2 sons in favor of, by Cleopatra, in favor of her son by Julius Caesar. He promotes Caesarion constantly in all of this, and therefore it works for her. I should say, that I think Cleopatra was a great diplomat and a politician, and she used men not for sexual pleasure. She wasn't this kind of femme fatale that the Roman poets made her into, but she certainly was able to play men very, very well. And I think if Pompey had marched into Alexandria successfully rather than Julius Caesar, somehow she would have made an alliance with him. And it's also said that, after Antony's suicide, that she also made a beeline for Octavian as well, and probably wanted to make a deal with him. But, Octavian, the cold fish that he was so shut down to all of this kind of thing. He just couldn't, she just couldn't get through to him, as it were. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But what I think is important, and what comes out in my book, I really hope, is that we've kind of made Cleopatra VII this kind of lone wolf of ancient history. She's such a towering figure, and every generation has kind of printed themselves onto Cleopatra. So nowadays, I mean, she's there as a feminist icon. She's there in the Me Too movement. She's there in Black Lives Matter. She's been claimed by so many generations that she's now a kind of an abstract. But if you put her back into the history of the world in which she actually operated, you can see her best, how she best operates, when you put it in the context of the women of her family, because she really is a Cleopatra. She borrows so much, in fact, from Cleopatra III. That is her model. It's no mistake, I think, that when on her final coinage, minted with Mark Antony, she calls herself Nearthotera Cleopatra, the new Isis, the new goddess. That is to say, the new version of Isis that Cleopatra III had been before. Without doubt, she knew her family history. There's no doubt about that. And she understood the strength of these other Cleopatras, including her own mother, Cleopatra VI. Lots and lots of ink has been spilled over Cleopatra VI's mother. And of course, the Netflix series recently has suggested that Cleopatra was black because her mother might have been an Egyptian concubine. Well, people haven't been looking in the right places for evidence for Cleopatra's mother. It's very true. There is no evidence in the classical sources for Cleopatra's mother, but in the Egyptian sources, she's everywhere. Cleopatra VI, Tryphina, she was a Macedonian princess. She was the daughter of Chickpea. Granddaughter of Chickpeas. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So, we know her ethnicity. So even Cleopatra VII, one of the most written about women of antiquity, there's still a lot of bogus stuff that goes around her, So the firmer we can set her in her historical context, I think the more fascinating she becomes constantly, And I think what I've tried to do here is try to articulate the fact that if Cleopatra VII shattered the glass ceiling, then she did so because the hammer blows had mostly been delivered by the women of the dynasty before her. They really broken up that glass before Cleopatra went through it, I think. And once we can see her operating in that vein, then she becomes more interesting, I think, even more interesting. And then the women of the house, the other Cleopatras, become an integral part of the story. And they've been written out of history for centuries. Nobody's really given them any attention whatsoever. And so I'm really delighted to be able to bring them back to public attention in the hope, as you said, that somebody might pick up their stories and run with them even further. Because every one of the 7 queens called Cleopatra, but I think there are about 10 Cleopatras altogether that I deal with here, various princesses as well. Every one of them deserves her own biography, I think, because they're all fascinating.
So, Lloyd, you answered that question beautifully, but I did want to ask a final sort of round off question to you. So, similar to, I guess, your last answer, but a little bit different. I was wondering from this book, for people who are watching this that have now picked up the book, which you guys can find linked in the description below, for all of those people that have picked it up, read it, what are the hopes that you have for them walking away? Not necessarily about this period, but sort of adding to the historical knowledge, or maybe hoping that they take away just about history in general. What's kind of a one sort of line teaching that you hope that somebody takes from this?
I would hope that the reader will be able to take away the idea that women in antiquity were able to deal with genuine power. I mean, the real power brokers. But I also hope they can take away the fact that historiography very often doesn't do them justice. And I'll finish on this point then. If you try to look at the Cleopatras in general sort of histories of the Ptolemies written in the last 100 years, you will barely find a mention of them. So either they're left out entirely, or where they are mentioned, they are made into nightmarish images, harridans. Okay, so for instance, Edwin Bevan, in his brilliant History of the Ptolemies in the 1920s, he talks about Cleopatra III as being an Hyrcanian tiger, he calls her, sort of like soulless, cold. All of them are described, whenever they're mentioned, as being aberrations, sexless, Lady Macbeth figures, this kind of thing. And what's their crime? Well, their crime, it seems to me, was being capable women. And that's how, that's what historiography has done to them, is to judge them against, their sex, as it were. But these same crimes that these women commit are all attributable to the other Ptolemies, to Ptolemy I, the second, Potbelly. But they are judged as kings, and this is what kings do. But you flip the coin, and if a woman does that, of course, she is judged badly by history. It's the old adage, isn't it, that good women don't get written up in history. So let's try to see these women as genuine operators of power in a very patriarchal world. And let's get rid of all the pejoratives and think about how did they do it? How did they maintain that? And how did they manage to run this in succession for 150 years of Ptolemaic history? That's what I would encourage people to look at.
And on that note, it is about time that we wrap this up. So thank you. Honestly, thank you so much for joining me for yet another call, for yet another video here on the channel. It has been an absolute pleasure to dive into these incredible women and their stories. So for all of you guys who are at home, of course, thank you for watching the video, but also please don't forget, as I have said periodically, you can find a bajillion links in the description below. So don't be shy to go and check that out, to watch more videos, to engage with more books, to buy, obviously, the Cleopatras, the Forgotten Queens of Egypt. I cannot recommend it enough. I literally read it in 2 days. I could not put it down. So go down there, check it out. I have tried to link as much as possible so that you guys can go forth and continue to be nerds of the Cleopatras and ancient Egypt. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.